October 15th, 1981. A serene evening turned into a nightmare with a violent attack. The air was thick with tension as a young life was brutally cut short. Her cries for help echoed. The woman's pantyhose were tightly wrapped around her neck, a grotesque symbol of the ferocity of the assault. She was sexually assaulted, and her struggle for life was a desperate one. Her death was agonizingly slow. In the years that followed, Sasha Stone, who lost her mother at the age of 4, embarked on a long and arduous search for answers. Sonia Carmen Hirac was born on May 27, 1951, in Quebec, eastern Canada. Little is known about her early life and home environment. The first notable events in her life trace back to her teenage years when she met David in Montreal. The two fell deeply in love, according to stories from that time. When David decided to move to California, USA in 1972, Sonia followed him. Despite her adventurous spirit, Sonia had other dreams. She longed to marry and start a family. Their differing life goals eventually led to the end of their romantic relationship, but they remained friends. A few months later, another man entered Sonia's life, Michael. Sonia's happiness on her wedding day to Michael was captured in photographs, her radiant smile reflecting her joy. Soon after, their happiness seemed complete with the birth of their first child, Sasha, in 1977. David, maintaining his close friendship with Sonia, was named Sasha's godfather. Sonia was recognized for her sewing skills and independent entrepreneurial spirit. However, not everything was rosy. After giving birth, she struggled with postpartum depression, which worsened when Michael faced career difficulties. Their marriage began to strain, with David witnessing the tension between Sonia and Michael. To clear her mind, Sonia took Sasha and moved to Carmel, a picturesque community in Northern California known for its white sandy beaches, artistic vibe, and stunning views. Although Sonia had not yet made any drastic decisions about her marriage, she considered divorce. In Carmel, her long hair, striking beauty, and charisma made her a well-known figure. She also became notable for driving a Mercedes-Benz convertible. Her career took a positive turn when she became a rising star at Levi Strauss, working as a sales representative. In Carmel, Sonia formed a genuine friendship with another young mother, Caroline McBride. Their daughters attended the same school, which promoted children's freedom and creativity. This nurturing environment allowed Sasha and her friend to grow up happily. Around this time, a new family moved in across the street from Sonia and Sasha. The family consisted of Jean and Walter and their son, Michael Scott, known as Scott. Scott, 25, was studying photography at the Monterey Peninsula Community College. His volatile personality and poor manners made him a notorious figure in the neighborhood. Despite having no known criminal record, Scott was an odd and intimidating character with limited social aspirations. While Sonia was regaining control of her life and progressing steadily, some unsettling events began to occur. Caroline recounted that she received several mysterious phone calls with no one on the other end. Sonia also felt that she was being watched. One night in mid-September 1981, Caroline was visiting Sonia when they heard heavy footsteps outside the window. According to Caroline, Sonia did not know her neighbor Scott. While the subsequent investigation could not definitively link Scott to the phone calls or the strange occurrence in the garden, the later events strongly suggested his involvement. In the early hours of Thursday, October 15, 1981, Sonia dropped Sasha off at school and then returned home. It was then that Scott broke into her house. He managed to subdue her. The young mother, only 30 years old, fought valiantly against her attacker. Unfortunately, Scott overpowered her and soon assaulted her. Using Sonia's own stockings, he strangled her and fled the scene. Around midday, Caroline knocked on her friend's door multiple times. Worried by the lack of response, she opened the door, and what she found would be etched into her memory forever. Just a few feet from the living room, she saw Sonia's partially clothed body on the floor, stockings tightly wrapped around her neck. Her purse was nearby, its contents scattered on the floor. Caroline got into her car and drove through the neighborhood, screaming for help, thinking the attacker might still be inside Sonia's house. Emergency services contacted the county sheriff's department, and Detective Williams was one of the first to arrive at the scene. Along with obvious signs of forced entry and struggle, the detective noted a significant detail on the victim's body, a broken ring fingernail, suggesting she had scratched her attacker. Initially, the detective could not identify the object around her neck, but later realized they were stockings. Detective Williams then interviewed Caroline, and immediately a suspect emerged. The detective quickly reached out to Michael Stone, informing him that he was the prime suspect without disclosing details. Unaware of the reason for police interest, Michael hurried to the station. He was told the terrible news upon arrival. Despite being cooperative, Michael's status as Sonia's ex-husband made him a natural suspect. However, Williams soon realized that pursuing this lead solely based on their relationship was unwise. News of the crime quickly spread through the community. Initially, residents of the picturesque coastal town were in disbelief, but soon a profound fear took hold. In a place where such a crime seemed unthinkable, trust among neighbors eroded. Detective Williams continued his investigation, which led him to focus on Sonia's neighbor, Scott. He approached Scott, who was injured, and claimed his injury was self-inflicted while cutting acrylic sheets in his backyard. Throughout the conversation, the officer noticed Scott's nervousness, stammering, and mumbling. These observations led the detective to consider Scott a potential suspect. These initial impressions were documented in an official report, which also included opinions gathered from interviewing various neighbors. When police spoke to Scott's parents, they learned he had given them a completely different explanation for his injury, claiming it resulted from a fight at school. To verify Scott's story, the police examined his workbench and the acrylic sheets, but found no bloodstains. When they interviewed one of his friends named Michelle, she initially said that Scott mentioned getting the scratch in an argument. Later, however, she confessed that Scott admitted being at the crime scene that morning. As authorities built their case against the prime suspect, Sonia's loved ones bid her a final farewell. The tragic actions of Scott left young Sasha bearing an unbearable burden. She suffered from night terrors and traumatic nightmares, often seeing herself as Little Red Riding Hood chased by a terrifying wolf. She would wake up screaming every night. On Monday, December 19, 1981, Scott was arrested at a traffic light for 2 outstanding speeding tickets. A detective from the Monterey County Sheriff's Office in California approached Scott's vehicle with a warrant for his DNA. Although Scott requested to speak with a lawyer, he denied him this right. This marked the beginning of several errors that negatively impacted the case. Once at the station, Scott was booked, fingerprinted, and photographed, with the police aiming to capture an image of the cut on his cheek. They proceeded to interrogate him about Sonia's murder, which was legally questionable. During the interrogation, Scott claimed he had an affair with Sonia and was at her house the day of the crime but denied any involvement in the fatal attack. Additionally, after typing up the interview reports, investigators destroyed the original case notes. With the interrogation report in hand, the deputy district attorney noted inconsistencies in Scott's account. Scott was subjected to a polygraph test and failed. At that time, DNA evidence as we know it today did not exist. The samples collected at the crime scene only allowed for blood type and other genetic markers to be identified. The tissue found under Sonia's broken nail revealed a blood type that did not match Michael's, her ex-husband. Soon after, Scott was charged with first-degree murder. Initially, Scott's trial was scheduled to begin on March 7, 1982, but repeated delays pushed it to November of the same year. One of the first to testify was a forensic serologist, an expert in biological fluids, who examined blood, semen, and urine from both the victim and the accused. He testified there was no evidence of sexual assault on Sonia's body. Next, the chief forensic pathologist from San Francisco and an expert in reconstructing sexual assault scenes stated that the evidence of such an assault did exist, particularly noting the bruises on Sonia's body. Michelle Wilson, Scott's close friend, testified for the prosecution. However, her testimony was confusing as she retracted her earlier statements, denying what she had allegedly said Scott had told her about that day. Michelle admitted that the passage of time had made her unsure about the events, leading to her being reprimanded during the following day's proceedings. On November 13, 1982, Scott's parents denied seeing a scratch on their son's face. Meanwhile, some witnesses placed Scott near Sonia's home, and the prosecution insisted the scratch on his face resulted from a struggle with Sonia. When the defense attorney requested additional time to review witness statements, the trial was further delayed, leaving the year 1982 to end without resolution. In April 1983, the defense moved to dismiss the murder charges against Scott, which the judge denied. However, the judge expressed doubts about Scott's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. On June 20, 1983, the judge criticized the investigators' procedures as unethical and illegal, pointing out that Scott was interrogated while in a psychologically weakened state. Consequently, he dismissed the murder charges against Scott. This was a significant blow to both the prosecutor and the police team. Scott seemed to have gotten away with it, but his relief was short-lived as he was brought to trial again in August 1983. As expected, he pleaded not guilty. 2 months later, the case was impacted once more by the initial haste of the police, who had interrogated Scott without honoring his request to speak with a lawyer. This time, a judge from the Montgomery County Superior Court invalidated the evidence obtained during Scott's arrest and interrogation, deeming it illegal. This allowed the defense to argue that their client had been harmed by what they called tainted evidence. During the hearing on November 17, 1983, neighbors provided varying accounts of Scott's whereabouts that day. An emergency physician from the local hospital testified that the laceration on Scott's face was consistent with a scratch from a fingernail. The credibility of the witnesses' reports negatively impacted the prosecution's case. Compounding the issue was the fact that the investigators' original notes had been destroyed. There was no way to verify what was said and what the officer had noted, making it impossible to contrast with the typewritten statements. The defense attorney pointed out discrepancies between the typewritten statements and the witnesses' testimonies on the stand. On November 24, 1983, Scott claimed he had been playing softball the day of the crime. Apparently, none of his softball teammates were contacted. 2 weeks later, when the jury failed to reach a unanimous verdict, the judge declared a mistrial. Scott, visibly relieved, spoke to the press outside the courthouse, stating that he was not surprised by the decision as he had always maintained his innocence and felt he had been falsely accused. Following the 2 judicial setbacks, the prosecutors dismissed the case, concluding that the available evidence was insufficient for a conviction. Scott then lived as a free man, finding work as a forklift operator for a well-known American retailer of tools and home goods. In 2007, he also secured employment as a school bus driver for the Salinas Unified School District. Simultaneously, he coached Little League Baseball, earning the affection of both the children and their parents. He continued living in the area, becoming a father and grandfather, and was never accused of another crime. In stark contrast, Michael, Sonia's ex-husband, became the focus of public suspicion in the absence of a convicted culprit. This scrutiny led Michael to leave the country and move to Canada. As Sasha grew older and fully understood the events, her anger grew, a rage fueled by the lack of answers and the fact that her mother's killer had never been caught. As a teenager, she turned to the detective in charge of the case, seeking to understand why the investigation wasn't reopened. Beyond emotional support and explanations related to bureaucracy and the law, he couldn't do much more for her. Resolving to ensure her mother's crime was not forgotten, Sasha channeled her energy into advocating for victims, dedicating herself to restorative justice, an approach that encourages offenders to take responsibility and recognize the harm they've caused through discussions with victims and community members. This work brought her immense satisfaction and allowed her to demonstrate great professionalism. In 2009, a significant event brought new hope for justice for Sonia. With the detective of the case retired, a new detective was assigned to the case. By then, investigators had a tool unavailable in the 1980s: DNA testing. The following year, a forensic expert from the California Department of Justice began testing old samples, including the blood found under Sonia's nails. The sample yielded a male DNA profile. The goal was to compare it with a sample of Scott's DNA, stored in small vials for nearly 30 years. However, at some point over the years, these vials had broken, spilling their contents into the envelope containing Sonia's nails. The material was so severely degraded that they could only generate a weak male profile from it. Although he believed Scott was the suspect, he wasn't entirely certain. To confirm this, they needed a new DNA sample from Scott. Lacking the necessary funds and resources, the county sheriff's office couldn't obtain it, and the case was shelved again in 2013. Many years passed without any progress until late 2020, when the county district attorney formed a task force focused on dozens of cold cases with available DNA evidence. A new detective was assigned to revisit Sonia's case. He dove into the old files and consulted past detectives to discuss the details. The deputy district attorney then collaborated with the detectives to re-examine all the evidence, deducing that some of it could now be tested with DNA technology that wasn't available when Scott was first tried. They discovered that Scott still lived and worked in the same county, and soon obtained a judge's order to collect his genetic material. The new DNA sample and the crime scene evidence were sent to the Department of Justice laboratory for analysis. The results revealed a conclusive match. Consequently, Scott, now 65 years old, was arrested at his home in Seaside and detained at the county jail on suspicion of murder. His bail was set at $1 million. The news shocked many residents, including students who had relied on his daily transportation services. The Salinas Unified School District faced scrutiny from anxious parents, understandably outraged that one of their bus drivers was allegedly involved in such a heinous crime. Swiftly, the district initiated the process to place Scott on administrative leave. Upon hearing of the arrest, Sasha, then 44 years old, was overwhelmed with happiness at the prospect of long-awaited justice. Scott's new trial began on January 30th, 2023. Although it was expected to last several weeks, it concluded in just 8 days, ample time for the defense to thoroughly cross-examine all witnesses. Scott's fate was sealed on Tuesday, February 7th, when, after nearly 6 hours of deliberation, the jury convicted him of first-degree murder. They also found true a special circumstance allegation that the crime occurred during the commission or attempted commission of a rape, making him eligible for a life sentence without the possibility of parole. Victim impact statements included heartfelt words from Sasha and her father, Michael Stone, who spoke about how the crime had profoundly affected their lives. In April 2023, Sasha took the stage as an inspirational speaker at the National Crime Victims' Rights Week ceremony in Salinas, California. Speaking to a crowd that included many who had lost loved ones to violence, she painted a realistic picture of the impacts of trauma and violent crimes. Sasha emphasized that overcoming such devastation required developing inner strength, resilience, humility, compassion, grace, generosity, and forgiveness. She concluded her speech by paying special tribute to her mother, who remained her motivation for her work. 2 months later, on June 12, 2023, Michael Scott, 67, was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole for the 1981 murder of 30-year-old Sonia Carmen Herock. Although the detectives never had the chance to meet Sonia, finding her killer more than 4 decades later meant a great deal to them. As the first detective in charge of the case, he had wrestled with the ghosts of not strictly adhering to the law, feeling a debt to Sasha, whose pain had always stayed with him in some way. Now, he was certain he had done everything possible to deliver the justice Sasha so fervently sought. Thanks for tuning in to Unreal True Crime. If you're intrigued by mysteries from around the world, check out our new channel, Latin Crimes, where we dive into the gripping true crime stories of Latin America. Don't miss out. Subscribe now for more thrilling investigations. Don't be fooled by images of this young man with a visibly beaten face. The reality is, he has caused a real tragedy. James Lloyd Allen was born in Providence, Rhode Island, USA, on August 29, 1954. He was one of 3 children born to Lloyd James Allen and Jacqueline Allen, with siblings named Danny and John. The Allens were a typical middle-class family, closely knit and active members of St. Thomas Church. The only out-of-the-ordinary aspect was Lloyd's job. He was a police captain in Providence. As a child, Allen admired his father and the idea of doing things right, though he still found time for some mischief during his school years. Allen is remembered by his family and friends for secretly listening to his favorite baseball team, the Boston Red Sox, on a radio earpiece during class, hoping the nuns wouldn't notice. Growing up with strong values of service, he eventually followed in his father's professional footsteps. His faith also remained a crucial part of his life. By the late 1970s, during weekly prayer meetings at St. Thomas Church, Allen's attention was drawn to a woman named Marge, who was from Bristol and 4 years his senior. Despite the daily demands of his police work, Allen was too shy to approach her. However, fate intervened when Marge was robbed and contacted the police. It turned out her home was in the area Allen patrolled. When responding to the call and finally meeting her, he found himself in a comfortable role. After taking her statement, he made several follow-up visits which led to dating. They married in 1988 at St. Thomas Church. She was 38 and he was 34. Allen and Marge had different personalities, but they shared the same core values and a deep love for each other. This love was the foundation of their wonderful family. They had 2 daughters, Jennifer and Caitlin. Allen wasn't the handiest person around the house, but he was a dedicated dad who adored his daughters more than anything. To support his family, he also worked a second job as a security guard at a supermarket on the east side of the city, which allowed Marge to stay home and take care of their daughters. Their marriage was mostly peaceful. They enjoyed staying in to watch TV or play with their daughters rather than going out. The only real disagreement at home was about baseball, since Marge was a big Yankees fan and she passed that passion on to her daughters. So, whenever they watched games together, there was a bit of a friendly rivalry. As the girls grew up, Marge started working at St. Thomas School. James, on the other hand, was all in on his job in public service, truly embodying what it meant to be an excellent police officer. His co-workers and friends saw him as a man of integrity, with a lot of compassion for crime victims and a knack for solving crimes. His amazing memory and observational skills, along with his resilience and courage, were what made him stand out. He always went the extra mile and was ready to answer calls even in the middle of the night. By 2005, he had become one of the most seasoned detectives in the department, honored with numerous medals, including the Departmental Medal of Honor and the Purple Heart. Known for his signature trench coat, rain or shine, James brought laughter and comfort to Marge and their friends. Meanwhile, Esteban Carpio lived nearby and seemed to be on the wrong side of the law. Born in Boston, Massachusetts on July 30, 1978, to an unknown father, Esteban was raised by his mother, a third-grade teacher. There isn't much known about his early years. As an adult, he worked as a barber and had a history of legal troubles related to substance possession. In the early 2000s, he started a relationship with Samaine Finn. They later had a daughter together. Esteban's behavior started to change for the worse in late 2004. He began acting oddly, claiming to hear voices and believing that a friend had cursed him or used voodoo on him. Whether true or not, his girlfriend took him to a Buddhist temple for help, where a monk tried to protect him by tying a rope around his waist. But it didn't help, and his condition didn't improve, so his mother called for a psychiatric evaluation. The doctors linked his issues to stress and substance abuse, but it's unclear if any steps were taken to address his substance use. The following year, with no improvement in his condition, his mother, Yvonne Carpio, took him back to the hospital. That spring, Esteban crossed paths with Madeline Gata, an 84-year-old active woman who loved her craft of sewing. She had worked as an interior decorator and had created custom designs for various clients. She was also a proud grandmother to 6 grandchildren and 3 great-grandchildren. On April 16, 2005, after finishing work early in the afternoon, Detective James grabbed a quick bite at a favorite spot before heading home. Meanwhile, Esteban, who was driving nearby, spotted Madeline. Seeing her as an easy target, he quickly got out of his car with a knife. He tried to steal her purse but ended up hurting her with the knife. Her screams alerted people nearby, and one quick-thinking neighbor noted Esteban's car license plate as he ran away. Madeline was taken to a health center where she managed to report what happened. Around 7 in the evening, James's phone rang at home, and he promptly answered. The call was about the attack on the elderly woman and the suspect's clear description, prompting the detective to spring into action. The police team, including James, arrived at Esteban's residence the next day. According to statements from Esteban's family, they warned the officers that Esteban was experiencing a mental crisis, having trouble sleeping, and was not in his right mind. Minutes later, he was taken to the Providence police station for questioning. Once there, he was led to a conference room on the 3rd floor, and, as he was not under arrest, his handcuffs were removed. Detective James, assisted by another detective, began the interrogation. James was armed, as per regulation. Initially, Esteban provided a false name, denied any previous arrests, and claimed innocence. When Detective James warned him that he knew his real identity and was aware of his criminal record, Esteban became agitated and asked the other detective for some water. After the other detective left the room, Esteban managed to seize James's gun under unclear circumstances and lock the door from the inside. Timothy, the other detective, later recounted hearing Detective James screaming for help, saying Esteban was going to kill him. Shots were heard, and when they finally broke down the door, they found James dying from 2 fatal wounds, one to the chest and another to the forehead. Esteban had attacked the detective with his own gun and escaped by shooting out a window in an adjoining room, falling onto the grass below. A chaotic scene ensued outside the police headquarters as local, state, and federal officers launched a relentless citywide manhunt for the suspect. Meanwhile, James was rushed to Providence Hospital, but despite all medical efforts, he was declared deceased. Esteban was apprehended after an hour-long search, following a violent confrontation with a taxi driver. His capture was not easy. He was combative and violent. The police officers struck him 3 times in the face. From there, the officers took him to Rhode Island Hospital, where he was administered sedatives and later interviewed. The exchange was captured on a recording that clearly showcased Esteban's distressed voice. At the same time, the doorbell rang at the Allen home. While their daughters slept, Marge went downstairs to find 3 officers at the door. She invited them in, and they delivered the tragic news inside. Marge, stunned, asked where it had happened. Learning it was at the police station, she couldn't believe it. Of all places, that should have been the safest for a police officer. From that moment, her mind struggled to function normally, and the pain hit her hard. The officers called friends of the Allens to stay with the girls and then escorted Marge to the hospital in a patrol car, as only a direct relative could claim the body. She later recounted how the hospital corridors were filled with police officers, all nodding respectfully as she passed. They led her to the trauma room. Her husband lay on the table. The wounds were lethal, yet not visible. On Monday, April 18, 2005, at 10 a.m., a second interview took place at police headquarters. A hysterical Esteban was interrogated again. During the interview, Esteban often rambled, insisting he was insane and unloved. This exchange was also recorded. Meanwhile, the police chief and James's colleagues gathered at the Providence District Court, awaiting Esteban's arraignment. Beyond showing solidarity and affection for their fallen comrade, they wanted to see the man capable of such actions. The tension in the room was palpable as all eyes turned to Esteban, who walked with difficulty, his hands and feet shackled. Several officers escorted him. He had bruises and cuts on his face and wore a white mask covering from his chin to his eyes, making him resemble Hannibal Lecter from The Silence of the Lambs. The moans and screams of his mother and girlfriend soon followed. His mother immediately accused the police of beating her son. Officials struggled to remove both women from the courtroom as they continued to cry out about cover-ups and police brutality. Esteban's face was bleeding and sweating. His eyes were swollen, and his cheeks, forehead, and skull area were severely bruised. His face was marred with multiple bruises and scars. However, such a mask, known as a spit shield, is used by law enforcement when a suspect is injured or combative. Due to Esteban's previous state, the officers decided to take maximum precautions and placed a spit shield on him. They explained that he had injured a leg, an arm, and his head when he jumped out of the window. When accused of murder, he responded by nodding, not denying the crime committed. He only spoke to tell his mother he loved her as he was escorted out of the courtroom. Subsequently, Esteban was detained without bail. Given that the victim was an on-duty police officer, the charge carried a maximum sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. As is common in such cases that shock the public, a press conference led by the police chief was necessary. However, many questions remained unanswered as he did not explain how Esteban managed to seize the officer's gun or the details leading up to the sequence of gunshots. He also did not discuss weapon-carrying protocols within police facilities or associated interrogation procedures, nor did he mention if there were any witnesses. Instead, he expressed heartfelt words for Detective James. James was posthumously promoted to the rank of Detective Sergeant. On April 21, 2005, a sea of police officers and officials accompanied the procession preceding his funeral service. Although it could have been held at the downtown cathedral, Marge chose differently, faithful to the story that had always connected them to St. Thomas Church. The funeral service was held there. After the religious ceremony, James was taken on a 4-mile final journey to St. Anne's Cemetery by a horse-drawn carriage. Marge was moved to see thousands of people, including police officers from across the country, lining the route. Beyond the crime and ensuing mourning, the case of the detective brought to the forefront a long-standing concern: the security in government buildings. Unfortunately, it wasn't the first time such an incident had occurred. For some time, visitors to the Providence Police Building had to pass through a metal detector. What no one had anticipated was that an individual would disarm an officer of his service weapon. In this context, Michael Brady, a police procedures expert and professor at the University in Newport, Rhode Island, mentioned that it was not unusual for a detective to interrogate a suspect while armed. Thus, James was not doing anything different from what police officers do daily across the country. However, the controversy over alleged police abuse against Esteban dominated headlines and online news portals. Later, an investigation by the Federal Bureau of Investigation (FBI) concluded that there was no excessive force by the Providence police, who were compelled to subdue the man due to his violent behavior. It was a special agent from the FBI who presented the report to the press, adding that if the subject resisted the police officers, they were fully justified in using whatever force necessary to subdue him. Despite these claims, Esteban's family continued to insist on the accusations against law enforcement and highlighted Esteban's mental disorder.
It's police brutality. He was mentally ill and he needed help and we couldn't get it. We tried and tried. And he didn't deserve this.
And in fact, his defense team centered their strategy around his mental disturbance. During the trial preparations, Esteban was evaluated by several mental health experts. The defense enlisted a psychiatrist and forensic neuropsychologist. After reviewing Esteban's medical records from hospital visits prior to the incident and listening to tapes of post-arrest interviews, these specialists concluded that the accused suffered from schizophrenic psychosis and an acute onset of paranoid psychosis. The state's evaluation was conducted by neuropsychologist and Professor David Faust and forensic psychiatrist and psychiatry professor Martin Kelly. Insanity defenses are used in a small fraction of U.S. criminal cases and are rarely successful. According to experts in psychiatry and law, jurors might be skeptical that mental illness absolves someone from a crime or fear that a not guilty verdict could ultimately release a dangerous individual back into society. Esteban was charged with assaulting Madeline, the 84-year-old woman, with a knife, as well as the murder of James. The trial began in June 2006. In his opening statement to the jury, the defense attorney acknowledged that the evidence of his client committing the actions was overwhelming. However, the key question for him was whether Esteban was too disturbed to be held fully accountable. One of the first witnesses was a police officer who admitted during his testimony that Esteban had been beaten during the arrest. On June 19th, the accused's mother and his 24-year-old girlfriend testified about Esteban's alarming behavior prior to the incidents. Following their testimonies, two doctors took the stand. Both specialists argued that the accused lacked the capacity to commit the crime due to the severe effects of schizophrenia, and thus should not be held fully responsible. The next day, the state countered by presenting Professor David and forensic psychiatrist Martin. Professor David testified that he had examined the results of psychological tests administered to the accused while he awaited trial at the Adult Correctional Institute and concluded that the administration of the test and subsequent results were questionable, and that Esteban's responses indicated feigning and malingering. Forensic psychiatrist Martin then testified that, at the time of the crimes, Esteban did not suffer from any mental disease or defect that would have prevented him from understanding the wrongfulness of his actions or conforming his conduct to the requirements of the law. In summary, they described him as manipulative, with a pronounced criminal and antisocial profile. After about 9 hours of deliberation, the jury rejected the insanity defense and delivered their verdict, finding Esteban guilty of first-degree murder of Detective James. He was also found guilty of firing a weapon during a violent crime that resulted in death and of assaulting Madeline with a dangerous weapon. Meanwhile, the cries of Esteban's family members filled the gallery. The court offered to consider a new trial motion after the July 4th holiday, but Esteban's defense attorney emailed the court on July 5, 2006, indicating that no such motion would be filed. The sentencing hearing took place on October 6, 2006. In his first public statement since the trial began, Esteban told the court that his life and health were fine until something happened one day that he could not control. Then, in tears, he apologized to the Allen family for what had occurred.
Every day, I face the facts of what I did and what happened.
The judge then sentenced him to 2 consecutive life sentences, one without the possibility of parole for the crime against James, and an additional consecutive 20-year sentence for the aggravated assault on Madeline. The judge harshly addressed the defendant, stating that the court had no doubt he was incorrigible. Thus, Allowing even the possibility of parole was antithetical in a civilized society. The Attorney General released a statement hours later, praising the judgment as a gesture to honor the memory of one of the best officers of the Providence Police Department. Subsequently, the Rhode Island Supreme Court upheld the convictions and denied the defense's request to reduce the life sentence without parole. As for Madeline, she recovered without complications. Since James's burial, Marge made it a habit to visit her husband's grave about 4 times a year. She always smiled, remembering that James rested near a cemetery path. After all, watching who passed by was part of his job. She consistently left floral arrangements that included a white rose, with no particular reason for choosing that color, but it became a tradition for the detective's widow. In 2015, on the 10th anniversary of her husband's death, Marge found the courage to consider her first interview. She acknowledged that, for the first 9 years, a physical pain in her chest prevented her from speaking. However, she eventually overcame the pain. During that interview with a reporter, she felt free to criticize the negative press often directed at law enforcement officers. Marge knew firsthand that police work is challenging and involves making difficult decisions. Once she broke her silence, she also addressed the numerous accusations of racism associated with her husband's case. When asked if speaking out would help her find closure, she disagreed with the term, stating there is no closure, just time that always flies by, gradually healing the wounds. Thanks for tuning in to Unreal True Crime. If you're intrigued by mysteries from around the world, check out our new channel, Latin Crimes, where we dive into the gripping true crime stories of Latin America. Don't miss out. Subscribe now for more thrilling investigations.